Do you know a cha-cha from a waltz? Are you a professional wallflower? Well, then listen up, Pipsqueaks, because we got the podcast for you. Eat your wheat cakes, refill your web cartridges, and stow away your civvies. It's time for the all-new, amazing Spider Talk.
Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing Spider Talk. The amazing Spider Talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing Spider Talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gvozden, and I'm the founder and editor of SuperiorSpiderTalk.com.
And I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio, the founder of the Chasing Amazing blog and author of 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the first ever episode of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture. Both Mark and I have been collecting Spider-Man comics our entire lives, and eventually completed our chase of collecting every issue of Amazing Spider-Man. For the past 4 years, we've been discussing everything Spider-Man related with each other, Spider-Man's various creators, and with you, our listeners.
Yeah, Dan, the Amazing Spider Talk has always been about you and I passionately talking about the past, present, and future of Spider-Man. And that's what we're going to do today, for the most part, I think, right? I mean, in this season, we're going to be talking about the creators of Spider-Man, none other than Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And, you know, if you're going to talk about Lee and Ditko, why don't we start with the book that started it all? For the first time ever in this show's history, we're actually going to talk about Amazing Fantasy number 15.
Now, of course, if you haven't read Amazing Fantasy 15, which it's hard to believe, but there are people out there.
Why are you listening to a Spider-Man show?
Go and read it. You can find a copy of it just about anywhere, judging by our tone. You can find it in print, digital, on the Comixology app, or as part of Marvel's Unlimited service. It's pretty much everywhere.
And if you have like $20,000, you could buy a decent copy of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you just have $20,000 to spare, you could buy Mark and I a decent copy of it.
Exactly.
So whether you've read it a million times or not at all, we hope you enjoy our episode entitled Amazing and Fantastic Origins.
Spider-Man, how did it come about?
Well, I had already done the Fantastic Four and the Hulk, and we were on a roll, and we decided, let's get another hero. And I thought to myself, okay, but the thing with a superhero that you have to get is a unique superpower. Well, we already had somebody who was the strongest guy in the world, somebody who could fly and so forth. I was thinking, what else is left? Then it occurred, I've told this story so often, it might even be true. I can't remember. But I was sitting and I saw a fly crawling on the wall. And I said, wow, suppose a person had the power to stick to a wall like an insect. So I was off and running, and I thought, what'll I call him? I tried Mosquito Man. That didn't have any glamour. Insect Man, that was even worse. I went down the line, and I got to Spider-Man. It sounded mysterious and dramatic, and lo, a legend was born.
Well, Mark, like we said, Amazing Fantasy 15, it's a story you've seen told a million times in a million different ways. Peter gets his powers from a radioactive spider bite, and instead of using them for good of mankind, he's selfish and seeks out fame and fortune. But, like always, fate has a way of teaching powerful lessons, and in the death of his Uncle Ben from the very criminal he let get away, he learns, with great power there must also come great responsibility. We've seen it a million times, Mark, but when Spider-Man burst on the scene in this amazing and fantastic issue, there was a lot already going on at Marvel. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the history behind this issue and kind of where this reveal of Spider-Man finds itself in the timeline of human endeavors?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, just for some context here, I mean, the publication date of this issue was August 1962. This came on the heels of Fantastic Four and the Incredible Hulk already being introduced by Stan Lee and the House of Ideas Marvel. And after those two creations, Stan wanted to do something a little differently. And he wanted for Spider-Man a teenage hero, someone who didn't look like a traditional hero. That was kind of the big thing about it. And first he turned to his trusted artist compatriot Jack Kirby, and on Kirby's first take with the character, he actually created a very traditional looking hero. Basically looked like Captain America, but with a magic ring that gave the person spider powers. So Lee was just like, this is not what I'm looking for. So instead he turned to the more mercurial Steve Ditko, who was more of a monster mag mystery guy at Marvel. And Ditko immediately took to the idea. He came up with Spider-Man's kind of gangly, creepy aesthetic, with the wall crawling and just like the thin, gaunt physicality of the character. In fact, when Stan saw some of the initial pages, he was worried that Ditko had gone too far, and that the comic authority, which controlled the content of comics, was going to maybe not approve of Spider-Man because the code was the authority was very anti monster people being monsters, basically. Like there were no vampires or werewolves or anything of that nature at that time. They thought maybe this spider creature could cross that line. So Lee took the idea to his publisher Martin Goodman, who immediately shut it down because Martin Goodman was like, well, spiders are icky. Who's going to want a hero based on a spider? Plus, why is this guy a teenager? Don't you know teenagers are just sidekicks? Which at the time was mostly the case in comics. You had Robin the Boy Wonder was a teenage sidekick. Yeah,
and it's interesting, even just the word teenager, which is on the cover of this issue, this teenager hero. The word teenager was still relatively new as kind of an American word in the lexicon. It became widespread in the late 40s. So this is only 15 years later. This term teenager was really, kind of a new thing. So that hook for a character was still a pretty novel one.
Yeah, but I mean, that was kind of what Marvel was all about, was about trying to find these characters that were more relatable than your average comic book characters. So, Stan Lee, being the persistent person that he was, he, kind of looked around to find where he could stick this new creation in, and he turned to this comic book series, Amazing Adult Fantasy, which had basically just rebranded itself as plain old Amazing Fantasy. Apparently the word adult kind of gave, even back then, different kind of connotations to it.
Yeah, there's a great letter in Amazing Fantasy 15 from Stan Lee addressing the future of the magazine, but also saying that kids were writing in saying that they felt uncomfortable buying a book that said adult on the cover. And I mean, we can all understand why.
Yeah, no, definitely. And whether this is a part of the mythology of Spider-Man that's a tall tale or not, I mean, we'll talk about this over the course of the season. But Stan Lee, in hindsight, explains it that hey, he wanted to get Spider-Man out of his system. Apparently, Amazing Fantasy, even with the rebranding, was on the verge of cancellation. So he was like, I'll stick him in there as one tale of many others. Right, Dan? Because this isn't the only story in this comic.
No, there's 3 other stories that are kind of I would say Edgar Allan Poe-ish or Twilight Zone stories. There's The Bell Ringer, which is about a guy on an island that rings a bell during like the apocalypse. There's Man in the Mummy Case, which is about a man who's hiding from the police and hides in a mummy, I guess, sarcophagus, and gets transported back to Egyptian times. And there's the final story, There Are Martians Among Us, which is a favorite of mine. It's like, very Steve Ditko. It's got this great twist where you think that Martians are landing on the planet and they're being sought out by the police. Everybody's scared of them, and this couple are scared of being caught by the Martians, but it turns out they are the Martians in the end, and they're scared of being caught by the police. That's always been a personal favorite of mine. I mean, beyond the Spider-Man story.
I mean, these are interesting stories in that, I mean, these are a really good snapshot of what Marvel Comics essentially were before the dawn of superheroes and that publishing line took over. I mean, these were the kind of stories that they were pumping out. I mean, the Distinguished Competition had their superheroes like Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and all of them, but even still, like, Marvel was trying to more or less print stories that kind of captured trends in fictional storytelling at the time, whether they were westerns or Stan Lee will talk about doing Millie the Model stories from the from the 50s and early 60s. So these kind of like cryptic macabre stories or alien Martian stories. I mean that was, I mean, these stories are kind of dime a dozens, but the fact that they're standing alongside the first Spider-Man tale, I feel, is a really interesting juxtaposition of what the medium was at the time versus where it was going to be drastically shifting and going.
Yeah, if you look in the back of the issue, there's even like a voting opportunity for you to vote on by writing in a letter what your favorite story from the issue was, and the next issue would print the favorite story from the fans. So it was really like you can dictate where we're going with this book if you want to.
Right. Before the comic was released to the world, we got a cover which, the initial Steve Ditko cover was actually rejected by Stan Lee. I
think wisely.
Yeah. Although that cover ended up resurfacing a few years ago as a variant cover for Amazing Spider-Man number 700, and it's not a very dramatic cover, but I do find it interesting that Lee turned to Ditko because he had a different kind of aesthetic sensibility. But when it came time to make a big, dramatic, striking superhero cover, he turned to Jack Kirby. I mean, Kirby did the cover, so.
And that cover probably is what sold the character.
Yes.
People opened it and found a wonderful tale on the inside, but that iconic cover is probably the reason you can read a Spider-Man comic today, is people saw that and thought, I have to own this book.
Yeah, and right there on the cover and on the inside, we are introducing Spider-Man, and it's Spider-Man with a hyphen in those places. But oddly enough, throughout the rest of the book, Dan, there's no hyphen in Spider-Man. So someone call Dan Slott, because he would probably lecture you on Twitter about that hyphen.
Well, it wouldn't be the last time they mixed up Spider-Man's name in the pages of these books, but more on that later.
Yeah, but that's the general history of how this book came to be. But let's talk about this comic. I mean, it's obviously it's the most significant comic in Spider-Man history for good reason. But I mean, just on its own merits, not just because it's his origin story, but Dan, you and I have alluded to about this over the years. Like, this is a damn good comic in terms of its structure. I mean, the most amazing fact about this comic is that it's just 11 pages, and Lee and Ditko just work everything into this character. You get a full story. You know who these characters are. You get world building. I mean, it's just astounding that there's this much content packed into so few pages.
Yeah, there's not a wasted panel. I mean, it's got to get across so much information so quickly, but that means it's on Ditko to really crystallize the perfect image for each panel to get everything across. And I think not to short sell Lee, I mean, because Lee does some wonderful writing here, but if Ditko wasn't able to like get so much character across in all those little things, like we talk about Uncle Ben all the time, and you know, and the rest of the series will be built on like this kind of warm-hearted Uncle Ben, but there's really no evidence of that in the script here. You know, he's just this kind of like uncle that shows up for like 3 panels. Maybe not even 3 panels.
Right.
And, but Ditko, his drawing of Uncle Ben is just so warm. Like, everything has just got to be perfect. I mean, 11 pages, there's no room to mess around.
Yeah, and even in the instances where there is, not I want to say room to mess around, but room to, I'm thinking specifically the splash page. The splash page, it's just that one image, that very famous image of Peter kind of being, cast away by the other teenagers at the school with the shadow of Spider-Man looming over him. But like, there's so much symbolism in that opening image, and this is what we're talking about in terms of Ditko's storytelling. I mean, even when he just has one image to sell a story, he sells an entire story in that one image. I mean, you have the hand of Flash who we will later learn to be Flash Thompson, kind of pushing Peter out of the image almost with again, the shadow looming over him. I mean, it's just showing right from the get-go who these characters are, what the relationships are, where Peter stands in the pecking order, the cruelty of the teenagers that he is operating with, which is a theme that is obviously very relevant today. I mean, I guess that's just something that doesn't go away, unfortunately. It's not even just about packing a lot of images onto one page with the kind of quintessential Ditko 9-panel spreads. I mean, here we just got one page, and like you just instantly learn about what these characters are about. It's just stunning that one image can sell this much.
Well, and that would set, for Ditko very much a precedent moving forward for this title. He would always open with that one big splash page, whether it was to sell you on the contents of the book or whatever. And I think Lee too, he really brings his full storyteller, spirit and the kind of energy to his words to this page, selling you on this is a tale like you've never heard before. He's really hyping you on this thing as he does. He's the ultimate hype man. And in this case, I don't think he's wrong. Talk about a debut.
Yeah, and meanwhile we get to meet our hero Peter Parker here, but what's interesting, and Dan, you and I will spoiler alert, talk about some of these things in more detail next week or next episode when we talk about Peter Parker's character. But I mean, just right here, in these little glimpses of Peter. For a hero, I mean, obviously Stan's kind of bravado talks about this not being the usual kind of superhero story, but again, in terms of lead heroes here, from a personality standpoint, Peter is very unusual. I mean, what are some of your thoughts about what we see with Peter here?
Well, I mean, I think it's unusual, but very relatable, which is, I guess, like Marvel's whole thing. He's inviting them to go to a science exhibit, and nobody has any interest in that. And, I think too much is made about, Peter's kind of, social outcast status. I mean, he definitely is. But he is trying to engage with his friend, his peers in some regard initially. But it's the reaction to that that's so interesting. Is that the minute they shun him, he throws up this wall of kind of this self-enforcing wall of kind of anger and I'll show them, literally saying I'll show them, they'll be sorry, and it's someone that's kind of, they're cruel to him, but he is also cruel back.
Yeah, and I feel like there is an element of self-absorption here, which is, I mean, yes, he's trying, but whether this is intentional or not, the responses are like, I told you a million times, Peter, I'm not interested in this. And it's kind of like, it makes you wonder, the story before Amazing Fantasy 15, what was Peter doing? Is he just, so so into his own little world that he's not listening to other people? Does he think that, that their opinions don't matter because, he thinks this is great? Thus, it's, I kind of feel like I'm dealing with my 5-year-old here.
I was thinking about myself talking about comics to people that don't read comics.
Right. But, like I know you're not interested in this, but maybe if you just hear it that one more time from me, you'll reconsider, because the fact that you're not interested in this, I find uninteresting.
He does ask Sally Averill out, so good on him. He's got a little bit of balls there. Yeah.
And, we after asking her out, we get to the famous scene in the in the laboratory where they're doing the radioactive experiment with the spider, and the spider bites him. And of course, there's a lot going on contextually in terms of what's going on in the world at this point, Dan. I mean, what are some of your thoughts on that in terms of the radioactive experiment and the results of that?
Well, sure. I mean, I don't think it's a mistake that all of these Marvel characters were kind of born out of some kind of radioactive thing, whether it's gamma rays or what are the rays with the Fantastic Four? Is it just like space rays?
Well, cosmic rays.
There you go, cosmic rays. It might as well be space rays.
Right.
I want to lock down what exactly a cosmic ray is. Solar radiation, maybe. But I mean, I don't think it's any mistake that this kind of science-oriented birth of these characters. I mean, we'd eventually see in the movies him to go on get bit by bioengineered spiders, which makes even less sense than getting bit by a radioactive spider and getting powers. I get stung by bees all the time and don't turn into Bee Man or Swarm. But
hope not.
Yeah, no, me too. But I mean, there was definitely the nuclear fear, going on in the country, and there's been a lot written about these stories in relations to Russia and the Cold War and things like that. I mean, you could certainly read this issue of Amazing Fantasy 15 as kind of like a parallel to America's participation in World War II. This kind of very self-centered, looking only after its self-interest until it's a personal defeat causes a kind of radioactive retribution or retaliation. I mean, you could read as much politics as you want into this, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that the radioactivity stuff is very much reflective of the kind of pop culture of science in the early 60s.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely the atomic age in America, or in the world at that point. And, so after Peter gets bitten by this spider, we get this very quick but effective introduction to his powers. He's bending steel pipes. He's jumping onto walls to avoid traffic. And something that always struck me, and I feel like this has also been the case of every iteration of Spider-Man. And one of your favorite critics, Roger Ebert, pointed it out when he was reviewing the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, that he was disappointed about this reaction as well. Is the fact that, for someone that's kind of, in his own head and kind of as an outcast, is aloof character, I always found Peter's very kind of happy embrace of these powers to be a little off-putting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's married successfully in this comic with a kind of surprise. The only reason he discovers that he can climb walls is because a car almost runs him over, and the only reason he finds out about crushing steel is because he's climbing the building and goes to reach for the next thing to climb up and ends up crushing the pipe. I think you're right, but I think this book gets away with it to a degree because it's so surprise oriented.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's even more than the powers themselves. I think it's the biggest suspension of disbelief that this character would be so willing to embrace this, because right away after he runs through these powers, he starts to think of ways to augment himself even more. But I mean, like he's immediately trying to think of how he can capitalize off of these powers. And one of the first things he does is he engineers these web shooters, which is like, it's such a passing kind of thought, but like, when you actually stop and look at it, and we've talked about this before, it's probably like one of the greatest inventions in superhero comic book history, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that it was like Lee and Ditko's way of kind of getting away with flying for a character that didn't have the power of flight. And you can almost imagine the like idea room on this is like, can spiders fly? No. Well, what can they do? They can shoot webs and swing on them, which is awesome and is probably one of the biggest appeals to the character, but it was probably just born out of some dumb discussion about whether or not spiders can fly.
Right. But, at the end of the day, it's like we spend all this time, with Peter, like he's money issues and financial hardship is such a major theme of these early issues. And yet, if all he did was just patent those web shooters, he'd probably be set for life.
They do retcon it later with the, it only lasts for an hour, so the adhesive is not good for anything.
Right, right.
But yeah, it is a funny thing to think about. He's this kid that's sitting on all this kind of like intellectual genius. Yeah.
And then, kind of keeping with the theme of both moving the story very quickly, but also still packing in all of these very telling character moments. One of the things I really love is, when Peter decides to, try and make a name for himself, the first thing he does is he goes to this wrestling match with Crusher Hogan. Not Bonesaw, not Macho Man Bonesaw, Randy Savage. But one of the first things he does is, rather than just get in the ring and challenge him, is he puts a mask on, and he puts a mask on himself. It's just a mask of his webbing, essentially. It's not the Spider-Man mask yet, because he's basically wrestling with his sweater vest and jeans, right? Is that? I mean, am I misremembering that? Or
no, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's not even really any like eye holes for him in the mask. You just kind of see a faint outline of his face through the webbing.
Right, but the character moment here is he puts the mask on in case he fails, and that to me is such a, again, going with this thing about the conventional hero versus the very unconventional hero. I mean, this is a very unconventional thing. I mean, the Fantastic Four, they all had these powers when they were introduced, and there's no, I mean, they have matching costumes, but they're not covering their identity, and obviously, like, even with Superman, I mean, Batman, it's a whole other thing. But for the most part, these characters are not, it's not that they want to show their identities, but they're not hiding their faces. There's no fear of, what if I fail and I need to, crawl into a hole and die somewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
right. And that's what you're getting here. And I think it's a really pivotal early moment, because, I mean, obviously it sets the stage for all this other drama and turmoil to follow. I mean, it's a brilliant stroke of character development to have Spider-Man in a mask, because it creates so much tension for the character down the line. But, just in this one moment, it kind of goes back again to that very first panel of the story of this character that is unliked and kind of pushed aside by his peers. And even when he has something that would make him the belle of the ball, so to speak. Although if he said belle of the ball, he'd probably get punched by Flash Thompson. He's still kind of shirking to that person he once was, in terms of I can't just be out and proud and happy about this.
Yeah, and then, another character beat for him would be like the minute that he doesn't fail, he decides to just adopt the mask thing and make money, as a on TV personality. Well, he's approached to do that and immediately leaps at the chance, which I think pretty much anybody would, but he chooses to do that and remain masked, again, to kind of keep everything like under wraps. I never really understood why he decides to not show his face in that instance, but I'm sure it's part of his TV contract in some regards. I don't think he's necessarily thinking about accruing enemies at this point.
Yeah, although as we will later learn, even with his TV contract, they don't know he's Peter Parker. It's like they're just giving checks to Spider-Man, which is just kind of weird. So, we yes, like you said, he becomes this TV star, which I guess if today he would be more of a viral internet video star, which is more or less what the current MCU is exploring with the character. I mean, was that your takeaway from Civil War?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think it's like an intention on his point. I think it's more like people happen to see him. Like Tom Holland Spider-Man seems like he's trying to keep it much more like under wraps than this version of Spider-Man is, where he like literally seeks out the spotlight and is doing candle tricks and stuff on the equivalent of the Tonight Show at the time.
These bits on TV that he does, of course, leads to the pivotal moment of this story, or what would seem somewhat innocuous, but would very quickly turn out to be the pivotal moment, which is the burglar running past him in the studio. Cops saying, stop the guy. Peter going, that's your job. Worth noting, because we've had a bunch of movie versions of this origin story that both kind of showed it, being more spiteful and like I'm gonna get that guy by not getting the guy. You know what I mean? Like I'm gonna stick it to that guy. That's not really what this is. It's just Peter being
pure narcissism. Yeah,
exactly. Like I got better things to do, buddy. It's not like he's trying to screw over the promoter or the cop or anything like that. But and it doesn't need to be, because again, this comic is set up so expertly that this little innocuous thing turns out to be so critical, and it's juxtaposed here where immediately we have this scene with Peter and Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and Uncle Ben and Aunt May have gotten Peter a microscope, and he's like, just like it's what he's always wanted, and they just he's saying to himself, these people are so good, they're the only people that have ever been good to me, they're the only people that I will look out for once I become the superstar that I'm destined to become as Spider-Man. And lo and behold, like he's saying in that earlier scene right there, I am only looking out for myself, but then, I'll look out for these two only, except what happens, Dan? Spoil the story for us, Dan.
He comes home and Uncle Ben has been murdered.
What?
Oh no.
Spoiler alert, Dan.
And I gotta say, one of my favorite panels in this entire comic is the one with him, like, putting his costume on. After this, he looks so furious. He's got it half on, and he's a much different looking person. His body's a lot bigger. The way he's drawn, it's just a very coiled anger that you can see in this image. I love that image in this book.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. And although I just another like hindsight thing, I always found the cop to be very almost callous in this story. Like, hey, you guy, your uncle's dead. Sorry, your aunt's in there. She's a little upset right now. You might want to stay away.
Here's $5. Go see a Star War.
So maybe that explains the anger. Like, I'm going to get this burglar right there. I'm going to punch that cop.
And then, this murderer is holed up in the Acme building, and the cops can't go in and get him. So it's up to Spider-Man to go in there and get him, lest he shoot up a bunch of cops, as they try to get in there, or he sneak off into the darkness, avoiding being caught. So Peter feels, it's my duty to go and do this. Otherwise, do you think is he reacting out of, of course he's reacting out of anger here, but is there a version of the story where the cops go in and get the cop and Peter just kind of remains an angry guy and bitter guy?
I guess there is, but, does he become Spider-Man after that? Even if he learns who the burglar was, I don't know. I feel like him making that discovery, at his own two hands is what marks the transformation of the character.
So yes, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but yes, he does do that discovery. Surprise, everyone! The murderer is none other than the burglar from the previous chapter, and not to mention this book is split into chapters. Weirdly enough.
Yeah, it was at least what 3 chapters, I think.
Yeah, I think it's split into 2 around the Johnny Carson or whatever Tonight Show.
I think it's Ed Sullivan. It's supposed to be.
Ed Sullivan.
Yeah.
My mistake. Yes.
Oh, it's okay. It's a really big show.
So he encounters this burglar. One of the things I love about the encounter with the burglar is that it really saves that punch for people that aren't jumping ahead by kind of masking the burglar's face at all times. I think today we might say it's a little too obvious in that regard. He's got his hand covering his face, or it's always in shadow. But that reveal image is really powerful, even though Spider-Man has weird holes in his lenses that resemble the kind of Spider-Man costumes you go and buy at Party City these days.
Right. Well, what you don't know, Dan, is that outside the Acme building, a man named Flint Marco is sitting with a car that he's warming up, and he's actually the one that killed Uncle Ben.
No!
Stop!
I flatly reject that.
Sorry, Spider-Man 3, and your fans, all 3 of you.
And then, of course, upon this revelation, Spider-Man realizes his error and reflects on it while walking away sadly down the street. And then, Mark, what does Uncle Ben say to him?
Well, Uncle Ben doesn't say anything.
I know, because he's dead.
He's dead, and outside of talking about wrestling him over wheat cakes, we don't really hear a lot from Uncle Ben in this comic. But what the voice of the omniscient narrator says is, with great power must also come. There must also come. Excuse me, I'm messing up the quote. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. And then this would. I would say, then this would get a tribute to Uncle Ben at some point.
But really, it was Stan Lee. So we say thank you, Stan Lee, for being the omniscient narrator.
Yes, I'm very happy you enjoyed my Shakespearean dialogue.
Well, let's talk about this motto that would kind of go on to become like the credo behind Spider-Man and what he's most associated with, even if people are misquoting it. Right. It's a very powerful lesson, and one that I don't really necessarily think is repeated in the following comics until kind of, I think Stan Lee rediscovers that was kind of the hook to the character. But it makes for a really powerful lesson in this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you're absolutely right. When we talk about these Lee Ditko issues, I don't know. I mean, maybe the first Spider-Man quit story. I mean, it really doesn't get referenced much at all. Certainly in the initial thing. I mean, but that sense of the lesson that Peter takes from it, I think, is omnipresent. But just like the words themselves. But I mean, like today, those words are. I mean, they're some of the most famous words in comics. I mean, where was I the other day? And I was watching something on TV, and someone started saying, with great power must also come. And then someone said, great responsibility. I said, no. And they made some other joke. I mean, it's like, it's so part of the zeitgeist 50 plus years later.
Yeah. And so we're going to have a whole other episode discussing the creation of this book and the character and who is owed for what. But, there is a real feud between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko over who did what for this comic to create this character. But it's funny to me, especially in regards to this lesson, that Steve Ditko takes so much ownership over this tale. And we're going to discuss Ditko's objectivism in a future episode. But I can't think of a comic that has a more anti-objectivist story contained within. I mean, the whole point of this story is that thinking about yourself and prioritizing yourself over others is about the greatest folly that you could make, often to the detriment of the people you love surrounding you. It's weird to me that Steve Ditko would kind of take so much ownership over this story.
You know, I don't know, Dan. I seem to remember reading Atlas Shrugged and reading about all these characters on an island with, you know, basically keeping their talents from the rest of the world and the moochers, saying to themselves, I got to get back. It's my responsibility. No, that's not what Atlas Shrugged is. Trust me, I read all 1,100 pages of it. It's not what it is. It's the opposite of that.
But where do you land on that? I mean, where did this story come from, Stan Lee? I mean, is that very point, and we can discuss this in greater detail later, but is that very point that the moral lesson of this story really kind of tip its hat towards this being Stan Lee's, you know, thought?
Yeah, I mean, I in some of the research I did for the book, that quote is pretty plainly attributed to Stan. Ditko had nothing to do with it, and I mean, granted, it's the dialogue, so that was Stan's anyway. But it was like that lesson was not on Ditko's radar. Ditko was more concerned about, you know, creating this character's world and his physicality, and trying to keep things grounded. And, you know, Stan's moralizing and stuff. And I mean, in fact, Ditko kind of would not specifically that phrase, but in general, Ditko would kind of stick his nose up at any of Stan's moralizing, not just with this comic, but with anything. You know, it's like, these are just comics. Why are we trying to teach people something?
Well, I mean, you know, one of the things in the letters in the back of the book is that, like, you know, people really reacted to Spider-Man in this issue so positively. That's why he got his own series eventually, you know, this Amazing Spider-Man.
Right.
I mean, I think without that moralizing, there's not really much to this. I mean, we've come to love Spider-Man's powers, but I don't really think that's the reason anybody reads a Spider-Man book. I mean, you might love his web shooters and all that stuff, and trust me, I do. It's like happy circumstance that this character with such a great moral backbone and interesting character happens to have great powers as well. But it is that moral, I think, that's really the heart of this story.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I think the moral is what elevates this story, not even just as a great Spider-Man story, but I mean, this is considered one of the greatest origin stories and comic book stories, period, of all time. And I think a lot of it has to do with the morality of it. I mean, okay, you know, Uncle Ben is probably the most famous dead comic book character next to Bruce Wayne's parents, but, you know, again, similar to Bruce Wayne and Batman, and kind of what Batman took from that moment of his life and how it kind of cauterized him to take up the mantle of being a hero. You know, Peter recognizing the error of his ways and how it resulted in the death of his uncle is what steeled him to become Spider-Man. And that kind of twist and showing the folly of a character and how they can work towards a path of redemption, even though that path is essentially infinite. He'll never reach it because it'll never be enough to make it even for himself. Is the heart and soul of this book, and very few comic book stories at this point in time had it, and I still feel very few had it since. Right?
Well, it's that moralizing that allows us to buy into the powers, allows us to buy into Spider-Man. You know, Martin Goodman was probably right. People weren't that interested in reading about a Spider-Man. Well, they were interested in reading about this kid that learns a powerful lesson, you know, and like all of that stuff, the Batman, it's all goofy on its surface, but it's the character and his story that makes us so interested in it. And I agree with you. I think there are few characters that have kind of been grounded in such a heartbreaking tale, or one that reveals a character so clearly, even with expanded page numbers. These 11 pages are so much more clear than so many other characters are. I mean, I think even compared to Superman, you know, I think you really get so much more in this. But I do think that this kind of became the template. I don't know if they ever got it as right again, but it became the template for kind of the Marvel universe and their origin stories going forward. I mean, this linking of the acquisition of powers to a moment of personal failure or tragedy for the hero. I mean, so many people would get their powers through some accident that killed their family or whatever. I mean, even the Amazing Spider-Man movies would try to link Peter's power acquisitions to the death of his parents and some secret formula they were working on, and to the failure of that story. But like, this became the template for all those stories moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it made it much more character driven. I mean, like, certainly, the contemporaries or the ones that predecessors, I mean, it was all, and they got the, Fantastic Four, Hulk, Thor, they got their powers by accident. It was like, like they just happened to be, standing there when something awful happened, or they got cosmic rays or whatever you want to call it.
But the difference between them and Spider-Man is that, like, even with like Daredevil, is they got their powers because they were already good in nature.
Yes.
The Fantastic Four were trying to do an endeavor for mankind. The Hulk saved another person's life and got his powers. Daredevil threw himself in front of a truck.
Right.
Spider-Man was accident, but it was his mistake.
Yeah,
that made him special.
And I would say probably the most similar in terms of and using that template, and they came after Spider-Man, so it made sense, would be Tony Stark and Iron Man, and then Stephen Strange as Doctor Strange. Both of them kind of, and with that in mind, those two origin stories next to Spider-Man are generally considered kind of the holy grail of Marvel origin stories in terms of, self-contained, well-plotted, well-characterized origin stories. So it's no surprise that they kind of took the Spider-Man template and did their own little twist on it and were successful in it.
So are we safe to proclaim this, clearly biased, as the greatest origin story of all time?
I think it is because, and yes, clearly biased, but what always puts this over the top for me in terms of origin stories is not only is it a very famous story, but in the context of it's told so well here. I mean, Batman has a very famous origin story, but this is something from the late 1930s. It feels very hokey and dated. I mean, it's not until Frank Miller updated it through year one that it kind of became this epic story. And with Superman, I mean, the fact of the matter is Superman has a very famous origin story, but about 10, 15 years ago in All-Star Superman, Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely, they told the origin in one page. I mean, which was brilliant storytelling on their part, but at the same token was like, it just shows kind of how shallow that origin is. Whereas, there's a lot of depth and substance to Spider-Man's origin, and I don't think anything surpasses it in the medium.
In fact, I would say all the updates to it have only been detrimental to Spider-Man's origin. I mean, not to get into like chapter 1 and all that, but even stuff like when they go back and they recolor it with modern colors, they print it again. I don't like reading it that way. I mean, I'm sure it looks better, but like, I like the classic look of this. I wouldn't change a thing about this. And every new detail we get, whether it's Silk, the other person that got bit by the spider, which I still can't get past, like, all of it is detrimental. This story is perfect, and it deserves to be untouched.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a perfect ending point for this conversation, Dan.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches bees or just flies. Oh, God.
So thanks for joining us for our first episode of our first season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk 10. Our next episode will be out in 2 weeks on July 19th. What's the title for that show?
The next show's title is going to be Who is Peter Palmer? And that's
who?
That's not a mistake. Who is Peter Palmer? And we're going to be looking at the earliest origins of the man behind the mask, Peter Parker. We'll discuss what about the character is so enduring and what has changed about him from Lee and Ditko's original creation. Basically, we're going to finally put it down. Who do we think Peter Parker is?
So, the 150 plus episodes of you and I complaining about this is not who this character is, we'll finally have some context.
Great. Perfect.
So also for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed for a special review of Amazing Spider-Man Volume number 29 by Dan Slott and Stuart Immonen. Remember, for just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to our exclusive new issue reviews, Swarm B book reviews, mailbags, and more. And then for $10 or more a month, you get access to commissioned artwork. You'll also be supporting the continuation of the show, which to me is the greatest reward of all. What could be better than that?
Nothing, Mark. Absolutely nothing. So everybody be sure to click on the banner that reads Friendly Neighborhood Spider Talk Members Club over on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com, or you could just simply go to Patreon.com/SuperiorSpiderTalk, or just look up Superior Spider Talk there, and you can sign up and get all those exclusive episodes. Mark, you're a man of the internet. Where can we find you on the internet this week?
Yeah, Dan, as a man of the internet, you could, of course, find me on Twitter at ChasingASMblog, find me on ChasingAmazingblog.com, find me on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com, and, of course, order the book, 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. Dan, how about you?
Well, you can actually find me over on your site, Chasing Amazing, as well, because you wrote an article all about how wonderful I am last week. It is true, so thank you for that. And you can find me on Twitter bragging about how Mark writes articles about me over at @SupSpiderTalk. And, of course, read all of the writing of myself and our wonderful contributors over at SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. Mark, it may not have been Uncle Ben who originally taught us Spider-Man's immortal lesson, but that doesn't make it any less true. What were those immortal words again written by Stan Lee that would reverberate throughout history?
Yes, Dan, I believe Stan wrote, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.